Hi guys, this is Joni Backman, or Joni Backman, or Joni Beckman, however you want to pronounce it. I've been around in iRacing for about 4 years now, and during that 4 years there has been a lot of discussion about people wanting fixed setup leagues or fixed setup series because they are afraid of how fast the fast guys do with their open setups. A lot of people have the tendency to automatically believe that the only reason they lose on track is because the other guy is riding a faster setup. So there's been quite a while I wanted to do this video, just like as a personal experiment, and just to show the community a little bit of how much the setup actually affects the driver and the lap time. So what I'm gonna do right now is very simple. Currently the World Sports Car Series that I usually love to drive, I usually love to drive the Ford GT. They currently are riding at Sebring International Raceway, which is pretty bumpy, pretty technical, so it should be a pretty unbiased track to test this, because it takes a lot from the car and a lot of the setup to actually be fast, or that's what they say. I don't know the result of this experiment, but we will find out shortly. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do 10 laps with my current race setup that I'm currently using to race myself, like a properly adjusted open setup. After I've done the 10 laps, I'll see what my fastest lap time is out of those 10 laps. After that, I'm gonna load up a baseline setup, and the only thing that I will adjust in the baseline are the gear ratios, because the gear ratios naturally have to be adjusted, because every track has its own gear length that they require, so that you don't hit the limiter halfway along the straight. So I'm going to adjust the gear ratios and the brake bias. And the reason for brake bias is that usually the default brake bias tends to lock up the front brakes, because it's made like noob friendly, which means that the rear end doesn't snap that easily. But these are the gear ratios and the brake bias are two things that everyone knows how to adjust, and if you don't know how to adjust, then you really should not drive iRacing, because those are pretty trivial things to adjust, and each and every track can use the same brake bias. So that's just something that you have to experiment with, but those are the only two things that I will adjust in the setup, and we'll actually see how much time do I actually lose, if I lose any time using the baseline. So I have sebring loaded. Give me 1 sec. There we go. Screwed that up a little bit. So now I have a sebring loaded, and the setup is identical. You can see the setup is identical to 2015 Season 1 Sebring race, which is the one that I'm currently using. So let's do 10 laps and take the best time out of those 10 laps. gonna do 10 laps with this setup. Reason being, I just beat the current race world record by 0.3 of a second, so I would think that lap is pretty valid. You think? So now I have the base target time. Memorize that 1:58.879. So that I now loaded the iracing baseline. You can see it reading over here, identical to baseline. So nothing is changed at the moment. So what I'm going to change now is the two things that I said at the beginning that I'm going to change. I'm going to change the brake bias to 59.0, which is what I'm currently using myself. The traction control actually is one thing that could be switched off because I dislike the traction control. I'll switch it off. Okay, so brake bias and traction control off. Traction control actually slows you down if you're driving a setup which you're able to handle with a small drift. The traction control actually makes your exits a bit slower. So that's like a on-off thing. That's up for you to experiment. 59% brake bias, traction control off, and now I will change the gear ratios to match my own setup. As you can see, these are pretty far off from what actually is rational to use. But each track has its own 5th and 6th gear adjustments that you should use. Okay, so now the setup is identical to baseline outside of the fact that I changed the gear ratios, brake bias, and disabled traction control. And I have never tested this before, so here goes. So my previous best lap I did with my own race setup was 1:58.879. So here it goes. Fuel is full, like in my setup. Okay. And as you can see, the session optimal sectors are currently So 158.879, that was the unofficial world record that I luckily managed to pull off with my personal race setup. And here are the following, actually I think it's 11 laps that I did with the baseline, and the only things I changed in the baseline are the brake bias to my personal setup preference and the gear ratios to match the track. So 158.879 unofficial world record with the open setup, and the fastest I was able to pull off with the baseline was 159.759, and I actually had potential on few laps to pull 159.5, but those were the behavior of the fixed setup is pretty much very different to my personal setup liking, or how I race my own setup. So that pretty much cost me the 2/10 in the last corner especially. But as a conclusion, yeah, let's have a small conclusion here. So there you have it. My best lap with open setup, 158.879, and that is with race fuel. And baseline with race fuel, with adjusted brake bias, no traction control, and gear ratios adjusted to the track, 159.759. So the difference to the world record after 10 laps with the baseline setup, 0.880 seconds. So that was pretty much sums it up for today. I think sebring is a perfect example of doing this test off, because I really think that sebring is the most difficult track to pull off proper laps with any setup, not to mention baseline with no practice. So if I had repeated that test with any other racetrack, I would have gone way closer to 0.880 to my personal best lap times with open setup. But for what actually caused that 0.880 seconds, I would say the baseline has two flaws of doing so-called alien laps. First of them being it doesn't turn into the corner properly or as well as an open setup, which is pretty much a good thing, because normally a baseline is being driven by people with no proper throttle control, no proper understanding of how the setup works or how the car behaves. So the fact that the coast ramp angles, which is the diff settings in the setup, the coast ramp angle, which takes place when you're off throttle, I think the pushy behavior is a good thing, because you don't want the rear end to snap all the time, especially with people with not so good car control. So if people with less car control tries to do fast lap times, for example with my personal race setup, I think they would end up spinning every second lap, because they just can't control the throttle properly or the brakings. So I think it's a good thing to have a pushy baseline setup, or that pushy. It wasn't like extremely pushy, but every time you hit a bump, for example, and you had slight overspeed into the corner, the bump always caused the car to push very wide. But you were still able to pull off like above average cornering with a baseline setup, if you knew how to take the line into the corner. Outside of that, actually, the baseline setup becomes faster the further you drive, because normally, for example, my race setup is fast at the start for the first 6 laps. After that, the tires are losing their best grip, but the car is still becoming faster because of less fuel. But at the same time, even though it has less fuel, which means it's a few hundredths of a second per lap faster on the straights, it still starts to become slippery if I push it on the limit all the time. The baseline actually became faster and faster and more stable the further you drove it, because of the fact that the setup is pushy. So when the tires become a bit slippery, it actually turns in better. as long as you're not doing late brakings, which cause your front tires to heat up, and then it causes you to lose the turn-in ability. But yeah, as you can see on the screen, 0.880 seconds apart from world record after doing 10 laps of practice with that setup. So as a conclusion, if you're further apart from the world record times than 0.9 of a second, it's not the setup. So there's something else than the setup if you're further apart from the world record, and that's with the 4GT with the toughest racetrack in iRacing to do test laps with baseline. Like I said, if I go to Silverstone right now, I'd probably be within half a second. So in the end, I will show you my open lap and fixed lap next to each other with the telemetry, so you can actually see what's so different about them. But outside of that, I hope you got something out of this test. So now you actually see the difference between fixed and open setups. And I truly think a fixed setup should not be faster by default than 1 second apart from world record, because you would give people a fixed setup that is able to pull world records. That would actually be bad, because that setup would be too slippery for a lot of people to handle. But yeah, like I said, I will show you my top laps of both setups next to each other. But that's the end of this story, so I hope you enjoyed it, and catch you guys later.